Some trails are marked with paint, others with blood, and in deep Appalachia, you can't tell which is which. Tonight, Scribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The morning began with a kind of fragile beauty only Appalachia can conjure. A pale mist clung to the valleys like a secret the mountains weren't ready to share. My boots crunched over frost-rimmed leaves as the sky slowly blushed from gray to gold. I'd hiked these woods dozens of times, enough to know every familiar trail marker and weather-worn sign. Yet that morning, I saw something new. A narrow opening between two massive oaks, almost like a doorway carved by the forest itself. It wasn't on my map. Curiosity whispered louder than caution, and before I could think better of it, I stepped through. The trail was faint, almost shy, winding through underbrush that seemed to lean away as if resisting my presence. At first, it felt like an explorer's dream, a hidden path no one else had discovered. But the deeper I went, the more the air began to change. A low hum thrummed through my chest, too steady to be wind. It reminded me of the mechanical vibration. You feel standing near power lines, yet there was nothing man-made here, only ancient trees stretching upward like cathedral pillars. I told myself it had to be infrasound, the kind of low-frequency noise animals detect long before humans do. Still, my skin prickled with unease. Around me, the forest grew subtly wrong. Trees leaned at odd, impossible angles, their roots twisted into shapes that felt almost deliberate. The light dimmed even though the sun had climbed higher, filtered through branches that knitted together like a web. I paused to take a photo with my phone, but the screen glitched and went black. That was when the first thread of fear began to wind tight around my ribs. If something happened out here, no one would even know where to look for me. I decided to turn back, but when I spun around, my breath froze. The trail behind me was gone. In its place stretched an unbroken wall of ferns and thorny shrubs, thick and impenetrable. It was as if the forest had closed a door I didn't realize I'd entered. Panic surged through me like wildfire. I crashed through the undergrowth, clawing at branches, calling out. But my own voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the strange, humming air. The rational part of me tried to stay calm, reciting survival steps. Stop, breathe, think. But another part screamed that something far older and less forgiving was watching. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a stone marker, weathered and ancient. Its surface was carved with patterns I first mistook for random scratches. But as I traced them with trembling fingers, I realized they resembled constellations. Orion, Cassiopeia, and others I didn't recognize. My mind raced. Was this some kind of navigation tool, a map encoded in the stars? Then the humming shifted into something far more terrifying. Whispers. Soft at first, like leaves brushing together, then clearer, forming almost words. My name floated through the mist. Heart hammering, I spun toward the sound, and in the fog ahead a shadow moved, waiting for me to follow. I followed the shadow because the alternative was admitting I was already gone. It drifted between the trees with the steadiness of a tide, never quite solid, never quite smoke. The whispers stitched themselves through the humming air, a pattern I could feel in my ribs more than hear with my ears. I whispered back just to steady my breathing, counting steps the way divers count seconds underwater. Resin thickened the air, needles crackled underfoot. Fear didn't shout now, it negotiated, calm as a lawyer. The forest felt intelligent in that unsettling way. A closed room feels intelligent when you realize the window has been painted shut. The corridor of trees narrowed until bark grazed my jacket like sandpaper. Trunks leaned together over my head, their crowns knitted like fingers steepled in prayer. Every few paces I glanced behind me and watched the path seal shut, foliage flowing across it like water over a wound. Somewhere beneath the hum, a lower tone gathered, an engine buried inside the mountain. I told myself it was infrasound born from wind-rubbing ridgelines, yet the vibration felt purposeful, as if the forest was tuning itself the way a cellist tunes a string. But what they didn't expect was my stubbornness. Curiosity can be a compass sharper than steel. The clearing I found was smaller than the first, a pocket of dark held open by hemlock roots. Another stone rose from the soil, wet, with dew, its carving sharper, newer. I knelt, star shapes etched in spirals, a sky translated into rock. Where Orion should have stood, a single wedge was missing, like an arrowhead pried free. When I pressed my thumb into the gap, heat pulsed against my skin, gentle and patient, like a heartbeat testing a stranger's wrist. But what I didn't expect was the fog drawing back in a slow inhale, revealing footprints around the stone, mine and not mine, layered like palimpsest pages. From the tree line stepped a ranger in profile, hat brim, heavy coat, a lantern breathing orange into the blue. Relief arrived like spring thaw. He didn't speak. He held the lantern at chest height and waited, and the fire inside the glass fluttered like a watchful eye. I called out and heard myself return a beat later, not echo so much as translation. The cadence altered, the emphasis wrong, like a sentence the mountain had learned to pronounce. Hope bent, not broken. I walked closer. The lantern's glow brightened, then dimmed. 3 short pulses, a pause, 3 more. I froze. In the simplest code I knew, that rhythm was a plea. The ranger lifted the lantern higher and shadows scissored across his face, rearranging features into several people at once the way clouds make animals. I smelled river rock and wet metal, the post-storm scent of electricity. Behind him the hemlocks leaned as if listening. The hum dropped a note lower, and 3 stones near my boots quivered without moving, like drums remembering a song. I told myself to think like a scientist and like a human at once. The stones were maps. Maps are promises. The hum was frequency. Frequency shapes bodies and moods. The face before me was impossible. Impossibility is only a word for things we have not measured yet. I raised my hand the way people do at crossings and walked into the lantern light. It spilled over my coat, warm as breath. The ranger's mouth opened, finally forming a word, and somewhere behind me the trail breathed in. What exactly was it asking of me? The figure dissolved into mist before I could take another step, leaving me standing alone in the half-light of the forest. My breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale curling like smoke in the cold dawn air. I wanted to run back the way I came, but behind me there was no path, only a wall of black-green undergrowth that seemed to pulse as if the forest itself had a heartbeat. Then I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint at first, like leaves, stirring after a storm, but the sound carried a strange cadence, too deliberate to be random. I followed it, not out of bravery, but out of a strange compulsion, as if the voices were tugging invisible threads knotted around my ribs. The forest floor dipped into a hollow where the mist pooled like milk in a dark bowl. My boots sank into moss that muffled every step, and I realized with a sick twist of my stomach that the usual forest noises were gone. No bird song, no insects. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the whispering, layered and overlapping like tangled radio frequencies, searching for a clear signal. As the trees opened into a grove, the sound grew sharper. Towering trunks surrounded the clearing, their bark pale and smooth like the bones of ancient creatures. I stopped, head tilted, listening. My background in bioacoustics offered a fragile thread of logic to cling to. Certain tree species can produce faint tonal vibrations when the wind moves through their hollows, like flutes carved by nature. Perhaps this was a perfect storm of environment and physics, a natural phenomenon amplified by the strange geometry of the grove. It was comforting to believe that for exactly 3 seconds. Then the whispers shifted. Amid the indistinct murmur, a single word emerged with chilling clarity. My name. It wasn't shouted. It was breathed, intimate and close, as if spoken directly into my ear. My blood turned to ice. The rational explanation cracked like thin glass beneath my feet. Instinct took over, and I bolted, crashing through the silent grove, branches clawing at my jacket. The forest seemed to lean inward, narrowing like a tunnel as the voices rose behind me, urgent and hungry. I didn't stop running until I stumbled into another small clearing. There, half buried under wet leaves, lay a tattered backpack. Its faded fabric bore the logo of an outdoor brand that hadn't existed for decades. Kneeling, I unzipped it with shaking hands and found an old journal wrapped in waxed canvas. The pages were fragile. 32 years ago. The ink was smeared, the handwriting erratic. It ended with a single chilling sentence. "Something walks between the trees at night." My stomach dropped as the light around me dimmed unnaturally fast, like the sun itself had been swallowed. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, I heard footsteps approaching, deliberate and slow. The steps closed in with the patience of rain, each one pressing a circle of silence into the leaf litter. I tightened my grip on the journal until the spine creaked, then forced myself to breathe in counts. The scientist in me tried to sequence the fear like data. Unknown acoustic source, possible human, possible animal, unknown intent. Yet the grove's hush gnawed at the edges of reason, like seawater chewing chalk. If birds and insects had vacated, something higher on the food chain was. I called out, voice steadier than I felt, and the footsteps halted 10 paces away. The air smelled like cold iron and crushed nettle. Between two hemlocks, a darkness shifted, tall and thin, as if the forest had pinched itself into a person. My name drifted out again, not spoken as exhaled from the bark. And in that quiver of sound I heard layered copies of me. Cadence, breath, even the scrape in my throat I'd carried since winter. It was mimicry the way a river mimics sky. I opened the journal to the final page and traced the line about nightwalkers. Beneath the last sentence, almost invisible, was a faint graphite triangle pointing left. I turned, scanning the undergrowth. There, 3 stones half buried, each notched with a shallow groove. It hit me like a lantern guttering back to life. The writer had left a breadcrumb system. I took a step toward the stones and the darkness. Between the hemlocks advanced one step too, mirroring me with precision. Curiosity wrestled terror, and, for once, curiosity won. I set the journal on a stump and clapped twice, sharply. The sound snapped against the trunks and returned a heartbeat, late, filtered and thinned, like a recording played through snow. Echo suppression, I thought. The grove's geometry was canceling certain frequencies while amplifying others. A sound trap, coded like a forgotten map. But what happens when a trap learns? I moved along the line of stones, placing my boots where damp leaves darkened the soil. The figure followed but kept the same distance, as if tethered by an invisible rope. Every few steps, the whispers reassembled into near language. Splash, ash, lash, mouth shapes in the dark, doing their best to become meaning. Awe skated under my fear. Whatever lived here wasn't just imitating, it was iterating, running experiments with my voice. The stones led to a ring of pale-barked trees encircling a depression no larger than a canoe. Inside, the silence thickened until it was weight, a velvet anechoic chamber carved by time. My chest vibrated with the subsonic hum. My thoughts felt magnetized, nudged into alignment. I crouched and pressed my ear to a trunk. A slow, vascular murmur moved inside, sap and wind conversing like old relatives. If the grove was an instrument, this ring was the resonant chamber. I spoke softly into the hollow. I'm not prey. The trees shivered, releasing a mist of dew so fine it felt like breath. From behind, the footsteps edged closer, then stopped at the boundary of the ring. My name came again, but now it carried a new inflection, questioning, almost polite. I lifted the journal like an offering. If I step into the center, will you finally speak? Or will the forest finish my sentence for me right now? Darkness falls in the forest like a slow exhale, a creeping tide that swallows color first, then shape, then sound. I had been hiking for hours, driven by the fading hope of finding a recognizable landmark. But now the world had been reduced to a blur of black trees and the uneven rasp of my own breathing. My headlamp flickered and died with a final pitiful glow, leaving me blind and disoriented. For a moment, I felt the terrifying smallness of being nothing more than prey in an endless wilderness. Then, through the suffocating dark, I saw it, a faint swaying light in the distance like a lone star caught between branches. Relief flooded through me so quickly it almost hurt. Someone was out there. I stumbled toward the glow, calling out hoarsely, my voice cracking like old wood. The light grew brighter with each step until a figure emerged from the darkness, a park ranger, tall and steady, his face framed by the warm flicker of his lantern. His uniform looked worn but familiar, the green fabric blending with the night. When he spoke, his tone was calm and measured, the kind of voice designed to soothe lost hikers and panicked tourists. He told me I wasn't far from safety, that he could lead me back to a main trail. I followed him eagerly, matching his careful, deliberate pace. The lantern swung in a slow rhythm, casting arcs of light that made the forest seem to breathe. Shadows stretched and recoiled around us, like animals startled by the sudden brightness. At first, I barely listened to his small talk. Bits of local history, warnings about the terrain, mention of storms that had come through last season. It all felt like the comforting hum of civilization bleeding into the wild. But as the minutes passed, unease began to bloom. His stories felt off. He spoke of a massive fire that had burned through these woods just a few years back. Yet I knew from a plaque at the visitor center that the last major fire had been in the 1970s. He referenced a ranger station at Crow's Hollow, a name I had never heard in my months of researching these trails. Each detail was like a thread pulled loose, unraveling the fabric of his credibility. Still, I told myself that fear distorts memory, and maybe he knew old names locals still used. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed wrong. The trail beneath my boots was narrow, almost hidden, its edges lined with roots that twisted like skeletal hands. When I tried to mark our path on my GPS, the screen remained blank, as if we were walking off the edge of the map itself. My pulse quickened. I asked him casually where this trail connected to the main loop. For the first time, he didn't answer. The lantern wavered slightly, its light sputtering. I repeated my question, louder this time. That's when he stopped walking. Slowly, he turned toward me. The lantern's glow flared violently, then dimmed, revealing eyes that weren't eyes at all. Just hollow pits reflecting the trembling light. My breath froze in my chest as the figure began to dissolve, the uniform and the man inside it unraveling into threads of mist. The lantern dropped, hitting the ground without a sound, and darkness surged in like a tide, swallowing everything. The dark closed over me like a floodgate, abrupt and absolute, and I thought I'd been sealed inside a jar. Where the ranger had stood, the air kept the smell of cold ash and wet flint, more weather than person. I crouched and swept the ground for the fallen lantern, fingers combing damp leaves and slick roots. No glass, no metal, only the forest's indifferent pulse. I called out and heard my voice return flattened, a postcard of sound mailed from another ridge. Some lies glow. This one simply folded itself back into night. I steadied my breathing and reduced the world to tasks. Orient, inventory, move. Counting 10 slow breaths, I found the dim band of sky through the canopy and chose a bearing I could love long enough to survive. Fear tried to sprint ahead. I kept it by the collar. The night felt wired with static. Twigs crackled like fuses. Hope was a wire too, humming against my skin, a low resilience like a heartbeat under a blanket. But what if the next light I saw was a hook dressed as mercy? A faint path teased the understory, so narrow it seemed sketched by memory rather than feet. I followed because forward was the only direction that didn't multiply questions. The woods breathed with me, inhale, exhale, bellows of mountains. Sometimes a tremor of brightness flirted in the periphery, as if the lantern still swung beyond the trees, patient as a fisherman. I felt the tug to follow, to surrender to shine, the way moths surrender to flame. Instead, I kept the darker corridor, the one smelling of creekstone and iron. The ground tipped downward, and the air cooled with the promise of water. Soon a thread of stream stitched the quiet, glassy and precise. I knelt to drink and caught my reflection wavering, the face a decade older, travel-worn, as if the night had sanded me down like driftwood. A breath of movement bent the ferns behind me. I spun with my heart in my throat. Only trunks, only fog, the patient theater of trees holding their poses like saints. Still, the sensation of being accompanied clung like cobweb, delicate and absolutely certain. I climbed the bank and walked until ink diluted to slate and then to pearl. Ridges surfaced as silhouettes, ribs showing under skin. When dawn smudged the branches, color returned the way hearing returns after pressure, timid and grateful. On a small rise where the understory thinned, dew stitched the grasses with tiny prisms. There the ground had been disturbed, a heel scuff, a crescent press, a shallow oval where weight had shifted and gone. But what they didn't expect was my insistence on reading ground the way others read weather. Kneeling, I brushed aside leaves and uncovered a badge face down. Brass softened. I turned it and the cold skipped my fingers like a thrown stone. The insignia was unmistakable, Park Service, and beneath it a district name, Crow's Hollow. The place the ranger mentioned isn't on modern maps. Apparently the metal remembered otherwise. I stood with the badge warming in my palm. Upslope, something flickered through the trees. A pale swing too steady for chance. If last night's lantern left no trace, whose light was waking now, and where would it try to lead me? Gnawing at me with a steady, animal insistence. My tongue felt like cracked leather, every swallow rasping like sandpaper against my throat. I'd been wandering for hours beneath the oppressive canopy, where even the light seemed reluctant to touch the forest floor. When I finally heard the faint trickle of water, it felt like salvation. I stumbled toward the sound, weaving through thickets of ferns until the trees parted to reveal a narrow stream, no wider than my boot. Kneeling at the edge, I cupped my hands, but something stopped me before the first drop touched my lips. Scattered along the shallow bed were pale fragments glinting beneath the current. At first glance, I thought they were river stones worn smooth by time, but as I leaned closer, recognition struck like a lightning bolt to the gut. Bones, dozens of them scattered like puzzle pieces, their shapes distorted and wrong. Some looked disturbingly human, phalanges, femur-like shafts, but they were elongated, warped, as if stretched in a grotesque imitation of what they should be. My mind reached for rational explanations, ancient burials exposed by erosion, or a predator's hidden kill site. But the arrangement felt deliberate, too precise, like the current had been choreographed rather than random. The water itself seemed to move differently here, curling in strange spirals as if reluctant to disturb its grisly cargo. As I traced the stream upward, the air grew heavier, dense with the sour tang of decay. The scent reminded me of an old biology lab in college, formaldehyde and rot clinging to the back of my throat. A few yards ahead, the stream vanished beneath a rocky overhang, disappearing into darkness. The stone face of the outcrop was scored, with deep gouges, claw-like scratches that seemed to scream without sound. Each mark ran parallel, like something massive had raked the surface while fighting to get out, or in. My pulse hammered in my ears, a frantic drumbeat that threatened to drown out thought. I crouched to examine one of the grooves, pressing my fingertips to the cold stone. The edges weren't weathered, they were sharp, recent, as though whatever had made them was still close by. The rational part of me whispered about bears or cougars, but the spacing was all wrong. Too wide, too deep. Driven by a mix of dread and compulsion, I edged into the cave. Immediately, the temperature dropped, wrapping me in a damp chill that clung to my skin like mold. The darkness was suffocating, swallowing the weak beam of my flashlight. The smell intensified until it felt almost solid, a tangible veil of rot and earth. Each step squelched in soft, spongy soil that seemed to breathe beneath my boots. And then, at the very center, I found it. A skeleton, half buried and half risen, its ribcage fused with the twisted roots of a massive tree that had grown through the cave ceiling. The bones were stretched, elongated like the fragments in the stream, and their position suggested agony, arms clawing upward, skull tilted in a silent scream. My breath caught. It was as if the forest itself had claimed this body, consuming it like a parasite. A ripple disturbed the stream behind me, subtle but unmistakable. Something else was in the cave. The ripple multiplied into concentric shivers, and the cave answered with a damp, throat-deep hush. I turned from the root-woven skeleton and leveled my fading beam at the stream. Silt lifted like smoke from a doused candle, curtaining stones and those obscene, stretched shards. I widened my stance the way field techs do when delicacy matters, and forced myself to inventory the present. Cold air, wet limestone, the sweet-sour bite of rot. Another ripple stitched past my boots. Whatever moved did not splash so much as persuade the water to move around it. Something traveled the ceiling, skirting the beam yet pressing weight into darkness. The first sound was a tick, then a dozen, miniature, metronomes on glass, resolving into a wet-limbed shuffle. I raised the light and caught it in a blink. A pale lattice flexing within the rock, like jointed roots trying on a skeleton, then gone. Hope flared and retreated, a match in a winded room. But what they didn't expect was my stubborn need to parse terror. If wood could borrow calcium, perhaps it could borrow motion. If bone could host bark, perhaps bark could practice walking. Crouched beside the skeleton and studied the welds where root met rib. Lignin had infiltrated cortical bone, a botany textbook rewritten in calcium script. The union wasn't patched. It was braided, coded like a forgotten map etched into the hill's marrow. I remembered a professor describing how trees whisper through fungal networks, trading sugars for signals and warnings. If a forest can share resources, can it also share memory, store what we were and redeploy it later? The thought slid through me like cold mercury, bright and poisonous. The stream seemed to tense, a drawn bow. My beam glided over a femur worn, into a spindle and stopped at an impression in the silt. A footprint that wasn't mine, long and narrow, toes fused like a canoe's prow. It pointed not deeper but toward daylight, as if something had visited and then backed away in reverence. Behind me, grit hissed from the ceiling. A crack feathered the rock, splitting those claw marks into mirrored halves. Stone remembers fingers the way old books remember thumbs. When rock learns touch, what do hands become? I backed toward the mouth, heel to toe, keeping the beam low. The skeleton watched with root-rimmed sockets, more witness than victim. At the threshold, the air changed, warmer, threaded with pine and iron. The stream slid around my ankles and then passed, rejoining itself the way a thought finally finds language. I risked one last look. The pale lattice gathered where I had stood, joints articulated from roots, a choreography of bone and vine rehearsing an old catastrophe. Awe and dread braided like twine pulled tight. Outside, day felt brighter than it had earned, a spotlight after a backstage fall. I followed the water downhill and drank only after filtering through cloth, tasting stone and leaf. The current carried more than silt. It ferried stories ground to powder. 100 yards on, the bed widened and the pale fragments thinned. Relief uncoiled, shy as a fawn. Then the channel kinked around a bend, and there under 3 inches of water lay teeth. Human, yes, each crown fluted like acorns. Upstream, the surface trembled against the flow, as if something were coming, learning to move against the river. The forest at night is a different creature entirely, stitched together by shadows and stitched apart by silence. My headlamp carved, a narrow tunnel of light through the darkness, illuminating only what was directly ahead, leaving everything beyond it to my imagination. Hiking after sunset had always felt like a private ritual to me, a way to dissolve the noise of the world and listen to my own heartbeat. But that night, the quiet felt staged, like a theater waiting for its curtain to rise. Even the crickets seemed hesitant to play their part. My boots pressed softly into the damp earth, a steady rhythm I had come to trust. Left, right, left, right. The cadence of my steps was familiar, grounding, until I heard a second rhythm trailing just behind me. At first I dismissed it as an echo, sound bouncing off ridges and hollows, warped by the uneven terrain. But echoes fade. They don't grow clearer. They don't sync themselves perfectly with your stride. I stopped walking, holding my breath. For a moment there was only the whisper of leaves overhead. Then, from somewhere behind me, came one last footstep, singular and unmistakable. It crunched into the undergrowth as though confirming its presence. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and a hot pulse of adrenaline washed through me. I spun around, shining my light into the trees. But the beam met only darkness and a fog so thin it seemed painted there. Logic scrambled to keep control. Maybe it was a deer shadowing me, or a stray dog keeping its distance. The mountains are full of unseen companions, after all. I told myself that over and over as I began to walk again, slower this time, listening with everything I had. My own footfalls landed soft and measured. A half-second later, there it was. The other set. Perfectly matched, perfectly timed. It became a mocking duet. If I sped up, the sound followed suit. If I tiptoed, it mirrored me, a ghostly dance choreographed just behind my shoulder. My breathing quickened, shallow and ragged. I tried veering off the path abruptly, hoping to confuse it, but the mimicry continued flawlessly, as though it had anticipated me before I moved. That was when I stopped pretending this was an animal. Animals don't copy you. They don't play games with your sanity. The trail curved sharply along a ridge, revealing a brief opening where moonlight silvered the rocks. I decided to test it, to prove to myself there was nothing there. Without warning, I broke into a full sprint, tearing up the path, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. For a few seconds, I heard nothing but my own gasping breaths and the thud of my boots. Then came the impossible, a second set of footsteps ahead of me, pounding the earth in perfect harmony. I stumbled to a halt, chest heaving. My light swept wildly across the ridge until it caught on a figure standing 30 feet away. It was me, down to the same jacket, same backpack, same trembling hands. Only the eyes were different, reflecting the light like twin coins of cold, unfeeling silver. Exactly where you expect it, and entirely out of your control. I lifted my headlamp, and the twin coins flared, catching the beam with a metallic patience that raised every hair along my arms. My breath dragged, like cloth over nails. The figure matched the tilt of my shoulders, the twitch in my left hand, even the hitch I have carried since a high school sprain. To watch your habits worn by a stranger felt like hearing your name shouted inside an empty church. I told myself to count, to use numbers as rope. 4 seconds in, 4 out, anchor the present. When I stepped right, the figure stepped left. The mirror's answer, not the world's. Gravel clicked, leaves sighed. The moon held its pose like a patient photographer. A thought needled me. Echoes repeat sound, shadows repeat shape. But what repeats intention? But what they didn't expect was my refusal to surrender the tempo. I clapped once, nothing. Twice. The figure stayed still, as if timing belonged to me. I lowered the lamp until the ridge dimmed to pewter. In the softer light, the face resolved. Not a mask, but a study. Fine lines at the brow, a faint scar near the ear. The tired economy of someone who has learned to travel light. Yet the eyes did not belong. They were reflective the way predators' eyes are reflective. A cold harvest of every stray photon. When I blinked, after-images skated the rocks like silver fish turning in a river. My mouth shaped a question without sound. The answer came as footsteps, not words. One pace forward from it, then one, involuntary, from me. My body wanted to be predictable, to fall into the easy arithmetic of accompaniment. I forced a change. 3 quick steps, a slide, a pivot. The figure matched the sum but not the order, as if it had solved for outcome rather than path. That slipped a wedge of courage between my ribs. If it learned sequences, maybe it could be taught mistakes. I slowed and exaggerated my weaknesses, dragging the bad ankle, rolling my foot on loose stones, letting my breath stutter. Pain flared, bright as lightning behind my eyes. The double absorbed my stumbles, then offered them back smoother, my limp corrected, my balance refined, my posture tall as a metronome. Awe threaded through fear. Something in the dark was workshopping a better version of me. A draft returned with notes in the margins, coded like a forgotten map waiting for a key. The trail narrowed to a knife. On either side, the drop dissolved into treetops, a black ocean, combed by wind. I edged along, palm to stone, and the figure glided opposite until our paths would cross in the center like stitch and needle. I killed my lamp. Moonlight took the stage. The eyes stayed bright, 2 instruments measuring me. Silence, pressed in, thick as felt. I raised my hands and began a clapping pattern from childhood. Slap, clap, cross, clap, snap. My mother's thunder ritual that once kept storm nights small. I reversed the sequence, then inverted it, then broke it into nonsense. For the first time, it faltered. The silver coins narrowed, questioning. I stepped forward and it stepped back. Confidence inflated like a bellows, fragile but useful. I pushed again, forcing the pace into irregular jazz with no forecast. Behind it, the trail forked into deeper shadow. Behind me, the ridge tightened like a tourniquet. Wind crawled the stones with static. The double's mouth lifted toward my almost smile, except without warmth, and then it turned and ran straight into the darker fork, my footsteps racing away from me. If the copy had learned to lead, what did that make me now? The echo, the shadow, or the intention it had stolen? The storm rolled over the mountains like a living thing, devouring the horizon with walls of rain and wind. My body was running on instinct by then, muscles trembling, lungs raw, every step a prayer for dry ground. I had been hiking since dawn, trying to find my way back to a marked trail, but the storm came fast and hard, turning the ridgelines into a maze of shadow and water. When I stumbled into a clearing and saw the shape of a building through the sheets of rain, it felt like a miracle. An outstretched hand offered in the middle of nowhere. It was an old lodge, its peaked roof sagging, windows dark and blind. Broken signs swung from one rusted chain above the porch, the letters so faded they were barely legible. The place looked abandoned for decades, yet the front door was slightly ajar, creaking in rhythm with the wind. I hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. Shelter was survival. Hesitation was death. Inside, the air was stale and cold, with the faint smell of mildew layered beneath something metallic, like pennies left to rust in a jar. My boots echoed on warped floorboards as I moved through the main hall, brushing cobwebs from my face. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight, drifting like ash suspended mid-air. The walls were lined with old photographs, sepia-toned relics of another era. Groups of hikers and families posed stiffly in front of the very lodge I now stood in, but something was horribly wrong. The faces in every picture were blurred, as if smudged by a careless hand, or scratched away with deliberate malice. I leaned closer to one photo, my breath catching in my throat. Among the indistinct figures was a backpack hanging from a chair. Its color was dulled by age, but its shape was unmistakable. It was my backpack, the very same one strapped to my shoulders now. The photo's timestamp, etched in the corner, predated my birth by more than 30 years. A creeping unease spread through me like ice water. My logical mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps the backpack was a common brand, a coincidence of design. Perhaps the timestamp was wrong, or the image was doctored. But deep down, some part of me knew none of that was true. This place was wrong in ways that defied language. As I explored further, the sense of distortion grew. Clocks hung on the walls, their second hands ticking backward. My flashlight beam seemed to lag a fraction behind my movements, as if light itself was reluctant to obey the rules here. Shadows moved in ways that didn't match their sources, stretching toward the ceiling when they should have fallen to the floor. The storm outside pounded harder, rattling the old windows in their frames. I decided to leave, to push back into the chaos of the forest rather than stay one more moment inside this warped place. As I turned toward the door, lightning split the sky, illuminating the upper floor windows. For the briefest instant, I saw them, silhouettes of tall, faceless figures standing in a row, watching me from above. Then the light was gone, and so were they. My heart thundered louder than the storm. Lightning faded to a bruise across the sky, and the upstairs windows returned to blank glass. Rain veiled the porch in silver cords while the lodge breathed around me, old wood flexing like ribs after a long dive. Instinct barked at me to run, but the rational part stacked risks like stones: exposure, disorientation, a storm that could shear branches like knives. A house, even a haunted one, beats an open ridge in weather like this. I slid the bolt and promised myself 5 measured minutes to think, a harbor inside the hurricane. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pressed, a padded cell for sound. I clicked my light off and let the dark accrue. Shapes thickened into furniture, quilts collapsed over chairs like abandoned hills. The clocks kept their backward reign of seconds, a glass bead curtain moving upstream. I breathed with them, counting the retrograde steps, trying to catch the rhythm's source. But what they didn't expect was how stubborn curiosity gets when fear is tired. I drifted down a hall where photographs clung to the walls, like barnacles. Each showed the lodge from nearly the same angle: porch, ridge, a stitch of cloud, yet the seasons fell out of sequence. A snowdrift sat beside green ferns. A spring flood blurred into a summer picnic. In one frame, a boot print smudged the doormat. My heart kicked when I saw its tread. The pattern matched mine exactly, down to a missing chevron on the heel I'd worn smooth last year. The dining room opened like a chapel, beams arching overhead, knot eyes set in a timber vault. On the table, beside a dented enamel mug, a wind-up pocket clock hummed in reverse. I leaned close. The hands shivered, then raced backward, dragging the room's shadows with them the way wind tugs smoke. I turned the crown a fraction. The motion steadied, then snapped to 0. Shadows paused as though held in a photograph, and the storm drew one long, waiting breath. Footsteps creaked above, not random settling but choreography, many feet finding the same board in sequence. Dust drifted in galaxies from the ceiling. I said the measurements aloud: temperature drop, humidity rise, latency between thunder and echo, because data makes a rope when the mind begins to slide. It helped a little. Still, the thought arrived that the lodge was less a building than a lens, focusing versions of a moment until they burned. I took the stairs, palm on the rail. As I climbed, every clock I could see zeroed its hands together, a chorus of beginnings. At the landing, the pictures ended, and bare plaster carried me to a single door held ajar by nothing. Cold pooled across the floor like spilled mercury, metallic and bright on the tongue. I nudged the door and stepped through. The room mirrored the hall below. Same table, same crooked nail, same stove scar. My backpack sat waiting on the table, mud drying on the straps as if it had arrived. Beside it stood another me, head tilted to listen the way I was listening, face smooth where features should be, and eyes not eyes at all, only glossy ovals holding light from no clear source. The door at my back eased inward. If the lodge could repeat rooms, how long until it repeated through the Appalachian canopy like diluted gold, brushing the forest floor in pale streaks? My boots whispered through the undergrowth, damp with last night's rain, as I hiked deeper into territory few maps bothered to name. The air held that fragile stillness unique to early morning, a moment when even the birds seemed to pause between heartbeats. I had been walking for hours, chasing the thin promise of a ridge that would give me a view of the valley. Instead, I found silence, a silence so complete it felt intentional, like a held breath waiting to be released. Then the scream came. It sliced through the quiet with a jagged, piercing note that froze me mid-step. My first thought was of a child, a terrible sound of pain and desperation. But deep in my memory, from a biology seminar years ago, came the recollection: red foxes. Their mating call often mimics a human scream so closely that it can trigger primal fear in anyone who hears it. That knowledge should have brought comfort, but instead it chilled me further. The call was too long, too sustained, trembling at the edges like a violin string drawn past its breaking point. I adjusted my pack and followed the sound, curiosity tugging harder than caution. The forest here felt subtly wrong. Birds perched, motionless on branches, their feathers slicked flat, watching me with eyes that didn't blink. Squirrels clung to tree trunks, utterly still, as if carved from wood. Even the insects seemed absent, leaving the air strangely sterile. Every instinct screamed that I was trespassing in a place that had rewritten its own rules. As I pressed forward, the undergrowth gave way to a clearing so symmetrical it seemed designed rather than natural. At its center stood a stone altar, lichen-covered and ancient, its surface worn smooth by time or ritual. Around it, animals moved in slow, deliberate circles. Deer, raccoons, a black bear cub, even a ring of snakes, their bodies weaving through the grass like threads in a tapestry. Predators and prey together, not attacking, not fleeing, just moving as if caught in some hypnotic loop. My training kicked in automatically. In field biology, predator-prey relationships form the foundation of ecosystem balance. When they break down, chaos follows. I muttered observations to myself, a fragile shield against terror. Perhaps a disease was at play, a neurological parasite disrupting behavior. But no known parasite could explain this harmony, this eerie choreography of opposites. It was like watching the laws of nature fold in on themselves. The scream came. Again, closer this time, and every animal froze as one. Slowly they turned their heads toward the far side of the clearing. My breath caught as a red fox emerged from the shadows. Its fur glowed with an almost unnatural sheen in the dawn light, and its movements were unnervingly precise, like a marionette guided by unseen strings. It opened its mouth. The sound that came out was not the cry of a fox. It was human, a guttural, heart-wrenching scream of rage and anguish echoing through the trees. The animals scattered in perfect silence. My own body reacted before my mind could, spinning toward the trail and sprinting for cover. As I fled, I grabbed a tree for balance, and that's when I saw them. Deep claw marks gouged into the bark, shaped unmistakably like human hands. I yanked my hand back as if the bark had burned me, heart stuttering until the trees seemed to flicker. The claw marks were too long for a person, yet shaped like our intent. 5 furrows, a thumb set apart, pressure deepest where fingertips should be. Sap bled clear and metallic. Behind me, the clearing exhaled, and the animals resumed their circling, as if a conductor's wand had tapped and been obeyed. I forced breath into order. Inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 6, numbers braided like rope. The fox stepped onto the lichen-stained stone and tilted its head with human curiosity. Eyes like pearls rolled in soot. When its mouth unlatched, the scream thinned into shredded syllables, not words but the ambition of words. But what they didn't expect was my habit of answering back. I spoke softly, the way field techs calm a snared animal, letting cadence do the work while meaning followed. The forest listened. Leaves kept their places, but the air leaned in, a microphone held to my throat. I explained what I knew: predator and prey align only when catastrophe flattens the hierarchy, or when something larger than appetite redraws the map. My voice steadied, an instrument tuned. The snakes tightened into cursive. The deer blinked together, a metronome. Far off, a woodpecker tried one tap and gave up, as if corrected. I edged toward a gap in the ring. The soil there was tamped smooth, printed by hooves and paws. And in the center lay more impressions, palms pressed, as though someone pushed upward from beneath the earth. The dirt had set around them like plaster. My stomach folded. If the forest can learn our shapes, can it also learn our gestures, our pleas? The altar drank a widening pool of light and returned nothing, like a well with a velvet throat. Wind combed the grass in one direction, a river in the air. The fox slid from the stone and padded toward me, each step exact, a painter laying strokes. At 3 paces it stopped and widened its jaw until the hinges clicked. The cry that poured out carried harmony now. A second voice braided through the first. Recognition startled my bones. Buried in that sound was my cadence, my breath count. My tremor, rehearsed and improved like a draft returned with notes. I don't remember choosing to move, only muscles already committed. I bolted for the gap, threading between a doe and the bear cub, waiting for chaos. Nothing chased. The choreography flexed to let me pass, like a school of fish parting around a rock. On the far side, saplings formed a narrow corridor. Each trunk wore human-shaped gouges, the 5-finger signature repeating like a stamp. I touched one lightly. The bark shivered, not with wind, but with answer. Day thickened as I climbed. Sound returned by layers, gnats whirring, a jay scolding, water ticking over stone, yet the rhythm felt edited, pauses falling where none belonged. The corridor ended at a ridge with misted valleys below. On a deadfall lay a tuft of fox fur, and beside it, 5 impressions in the mud, sized like hands but tipped with claws. I looked back down the green chute I'd fled as another cry lifted, closer, human. If the forest has learned my voice, who was it about to answer? The first thing to go was the compass. North slid under the needle like a fish dodging a hook, refusing to hold still long enough to matter. I tapped the dome, stepped away from my multi-tool, set the base plate on a rock to watch, but the card yawed in slow, seasick loops. Then the GPS began hiccuping coordinates that skipped me across ravines I hadn't crossed. When my paper map split along a taped fold, I felt betrayed, like a kid whose favorite book drops a page mid-sentence. The trail seemed to narrow and swell, a living vein. If instruments fail, I told myself, the body remains. Feet, eyes, breath, ancient tools older than magnets and satellites. I made the world smaller on purpose. One ridgeline, one creek, one measurable decision. I scored a birch with a grease pencil, one clean slash, then walked 10 minutes by the sun's pale smear. When I returned, the birch stood on the opposite side of the path wearing 2 slashes. I shut my eyes and counted to 8 the way I do before hard swims, then opened them to find nothing changed and everything different. Shadows leaned against the light, not with it. A faint hum threaded the air like wire inside a wall. But what they didn't expect was my stubborn ritual. Breathe steady, name details, keep moving until the pattern blinks. I treated the woods like a problem set. Triangulation, then verification. I chose 3 anchors, a lightning bit hemlock, a boulder shaped like a sleeping seal, and a snag curled like a grappling hook, and shot bearings. The angles made a neat triangle that should have enclosed me. I paced distances, notched bark with tiny V's, and drew crisp schematics in my notebook. 5 minutes later, I repeated the measurements and got a triangle flipped and fattened, landmarks trading places like partners in a square dance. Either I was wrong twice, or the room had rearranged its furniture. Uncertainty pressed like deep water. Curiosity answered like a fading lantern, still lit, still mine. Data first, panic later. I pulled orange flagging from my pack and built a breadcrumb sentence. Every 10 steps, a ribbon and a note. Charcoal rock, split cedar, ant mound. I followed my own grammar for 15 minutes and arrived at a stump wearing 2 orange ribbons that I didn't tie. In my notebook, beneath charcoal rock, a sketch of the stump existed in pencil I didn't recognize. The page smelled faintly of sap. It felt like walking into my footprints and finding them slightly improved. A draft returned with kinder margins, coded like a forgotten map. If the forest could edit sentences, what would it do to the author? I climbed to a knoll for signal, legs syrup heavy. A coin of sky opened, the GPS caught, and a blue dot steadied like a held breath. I took a bearing on a sunlit notch and marched. The ridge delivered me back to the same knoll from its other side. The dot trotted to my boots like an obedient dog. I laughed once and killed the device. Then the air shifted, ozone and copper, leaves flipped. I unfolded the map and watched contour lines blur toward a blank oval, ink retreating from a wound. At the center where I stood, the paper went thin ice. The black oval eating contour lines the way a spill drinks ink. I wanted to tear it off and pretend the wound wasn't there, but habit pinned my hands. Instead, I tested the perimeter like a scientist. Tapping glass. 3 steps left, 3 right. Mark, backtrack. Each mark slid a finger's width when I turned away, as if the forest breathed and the skin of the world shifted on its ribs. North wandered, shadows argued, and the hum beneath everything climbed like a tuning fork pressed to bone. Panic knocked, polite at first, then insistent. I pictured airliner checklists and whispered mine. Hydrate, fuel, pace, observe. If the trail ate maps, I would starve it of instructions. I chose a rule not on paper. Follow one phenomenon I could verify without sight. Sound is stubborn. I closed my eyes and hunted for water, the low arithmetic of a stream assembling itself from far-off clicks and a cloth-on-stone hush. When I opened them, the trees had crept closer, but the sound held steady, patient as a heartbeat in sleep. But what they didn't expect was my obedience to that one tether. I set a metronome in my head and walked to that rhythm, refusing to glance. Back. Curiosity can be a magnet. Today it became my blindfold. The air cooled and the hum thinned, like distance diluting a city. When I smelled iron and wet leaves, awe and relief braided together. A creek slid from a slot of ferns, its surface wrinkled by midges. I knelt and watched the current reorganize pebbles into brief alphabets. For once the letters drifted on without editing, like a sentence finally allowed to finish itself. To test the loop, I built a small cairn and a twig gate. Childish, undeniable. Then I crossed to the opposite bank and took 10 slow breaths. When I returned, the cairn leaned but held. The gate crooked, uncorrected. I refused to celebrate early. The forest plays long games. I followed the creek downstream, mapping with steps I counted and birds I named, turning the world into a chant a child could keep. My fear softened into focus, like a lens turning crisp. Landmarks behaved until they didn't. A dead hemlock I had passed once appeared ahead with new scars, like a book reprinting itself mid-sentence. I touched the bark and felt a pulse not from the tree, but from the air, a soft thud in the wrist of reality. I stepped backward and the hemlock slid a thumb's length to the right. Not imagination, parallax with intent. I laughed, a thin edge. If the room rearranged, I would move like water, taking shape without surrendering direction. Twilight filtered in, bruised and complicated. I fixed on a bright star peeking through the canopy and walked until the creek thinned to a ribbon of sound. The hum faded. The compass settled like a bird finally choosing a branch. When the slope broke open into a logging road, I nearly wept. Gravel underfoot felt like language returning after fever. I looked back. The woodland mouth behind me was only trees, ordinary as unremarked breathing. Only then did I unfold the map. The black oval had grown crisp and perfect, an absence printed, where contour should be, labeled by nothing. The road skirted its edge like a scar. I traced the border with one finger and felt the faintest vibration, as if paper remembered being rewritten. My phone blinked awake, coordinates locking. I marked the void and drew an arrow toward town, hand steady. Still, as I walked, I couldn't shake the sense that the blank kept pace beside me like a second shadow. Quiet, exacting, and hungry for the next line I tried to write. The forest was deep in its night cycle. That hour when, even, the wind seems to retreat into its burrows. My headlamp had been flickering for the last half mile, throwing spasms of light across the undergrowth. I was exhausted, my thoughts reduced to the animal simplicity of one foot in front of the other. That's when I saw it, a flicker of orange. Between the trees, a pulse of firelight where there shouldn't have been any. Relief surged through me like warm water. Fire meant people. People meant safety. I stumbled toward it, branches whipping my arms, mud sucking at my boots. As I broke, through a stand of laurels, the source revealed itself. A campfire, burning low but steady in a small clearing. Its glow painted the surrounding trees in trembling gold. For a moment, I stood frozen, breathing hard, waiting for voices or movement. There were none. The fire cracked softly, almost politely, but there was no heat radiating from it. No smoke spiraled upward into the cold night. It was flame without life, like a lantern in a dream. Around the fire lay the scattered debris of human presence. Backpacks, rain ponchos, dented cooking pots. At first I thought a group of hikers had simply stepped away, but the stillness told me otherwise. I crouched to inspect the nearest pile and felt my stomach knot. A watch lay half buried in the dirt, its crystal cracked, hands stopped at 2:17. Nearby, a phone lay face up, screen spiderwebbed, displaying a frozen lock screen. Wallets spilled open, IDs and credit cards peeking out like pressed leaves. Recognition hit like a blow. These were the names and faces from the bulletin board at the ranger station, the ones listed under missing. I saw them in news articles pinned to trailheads. People who had walked into these woods and never walked out. Now their belongings encircled this impossible fire like offerings at an altar. My throat tightened as I whispered their names under my breath, as if speaking them might rewind whatever had happened here. I forced myself to keep moving, cataloging the evidence with the detached voice of my rational mind. Watches, phones, IDs, all the things we carry to prove we exist. But the longer I stared, the more it felt as though these items weren't simply abandoned. They'd been shed, like snakeskin left behind after something larger moved on. A pattern emerged in their arrangement. Concentric rings, each layer tighter, leading toward the fire at the center. I stepped closer. The firelight licked at my boots but gave no warmth, no resistance. It was like standing at the edge of a painting. My pulse thudded in my ears. Somewhere in the undergrowth, a twig snapped. I jerked my head up just as a shape emerged from the darkness. It moved with unsettling fluidity, stepping into the circle of light. Its form was vaguely human, but its features were in constant flux, shifting from face to face like pages riffling in a book. I saw fragments of every missing hiker. The young woman with the crooked smile, the older man with the weathered hat, flashing across its surface. It stopped at the edge of the fire, and in a voice that seemed to come from all directions at once, it whispered, "You shouldn't have followed their trail." The words struck like a snapped branch across my cheek, sudden and stinging, and I tasted iron that wasn't there. The faces in the light slowed, one expression holding before it slid into the next. Questions crowded my tongue, but the heatless glow stole vocabulary, leaving only pulse and breath. Around us the gear inched inward, drawn to the circle like filings to a false star. I forced my mind into evidence like a boot into mud. A wallet, a photo softened by damp, a phone frozen on a lock screen, a watch stopped at the minute from the ranger board sketch, a wedding band threaded on a bootlace, a promise with a handle. The fire cracked delicately and nothing moved but shadows. But what they didn't expect was my refusal to take light as proof of life. I stepped back and the figures' faces flickered faster, a deck riffled by nervous hands. Why here? I asked the clearing because the clearing was listening. The eyes across from me belonged to no one and everyone, carrying the exhaustion of nights unending. The mouth shaped sorrow, and the reply arrived late, as if crossing rain. You followed, because they did, not a threat, an autopsy. Anger and grief braided in my chest, rope from a knot. Wind combed the laurels. The flame leaned without smoke. I moved around the ring, reading the arrangement the way biologists read tracks. Tools on the outside, shelter pitched closer, identity at the core, as if survival peels in layers toward the self. In the middle lay a child's whistle, neon bright beneath ash. I reached, and the figure stiffened, its many faces stacking into order, like cards finding their suit. I stopped and spoke their names, the ones I could drag up from memory, careful, steady, like laying stones across a fast river. For one instant, a single face held, the woman whose bulletin photo never quite committed to a smile. Awe and fury rose together. If this thing kept their last moments, maybe it kept their last directions too, coded like a forgotten map under the coals. "Show me out," I said, and heard a new steadiness in my voice, taller than fear. The figure tilted, listening for a rule the woods might honor. The fire guttered, a brief bow that exposed the truth beneath. Not wood, but a dark well of heatless red. The figure lifted a hand and pointed, not along a trail, but into unmarked trees where darkness stitched two trunks together like a torn photograph. I gathered what courage weighs and edged toward that seam. The light tugged my shadow long and thin, taffy drawn by invisible fingers. The figure did not follow. It kept vigil while the rings of belongings inched closer to the coals as if history were hungry. I looked back once. The flame folded into itself, color eating color, leaving only a red idea of warmth. I stepped through. The forest closed behind me like lips after a secret. Air smelled of rain and iron and the green of something newly broken through. Ahead, between trunks, a weak glow hovered. No fire, more like breath visible. I listened and heard only my heart. Then, from behind that pallid light, a lantern began to sway with no hand for days. Or maybe it was simply trying to remember me. My boots were ragged, skin laced with cuts, mind frayed from nights of shallow, panicked sleep. I had been walking in circles so long that the idea of a straight line felt like a myth told to comfort lost hikers. Then, through the blur of exhaustion, I saw it, a gap between two familiar oaks, perfectly ordinary and utterly wrong. The trailhead. It looked so mundane I almost wept. No mist pooling like ghost breath, no twisted angles or humming air, just a narrow dirt path opening into the world I thought I'd left behind. I staggered forward, my pack slumping heavily against my spine, every step a bargain between hope and dread. The trees thinned, and for a heartbeat the nightmare cracked like ice beneath spring sun. Everything looked exactly as it had on the first day. The faded wooden sign, the parking lot gravel glittering under weak morning light, even the candy wrapper I'd dropped near the edge of the trail. It was as if the forest had spit me back out, unchanged. But I wasn't unchanged. My skin crawled with the memory of impossible loops and whispering voices, of figures that wore my face like a borrowed mask. This place should have felt like salvation, but instead, it felt staged, like a set piece, hastily rebuilt. I stopped at a shallow puddle beside the trailhead, leaning over it to splash my face. The reflection wavered, cloudy from silt. My own hollow eyes stared back, bloodshot and rimmed with sleeplessness. I exhaled, and my reflection exhaled too. But then its mouth moved again, a fraction of a second before mine. No sound came at first. Then, barely audible, it whispered, "The forest remembers." I stumbled backward, slipping in mud, my heart hammering like a fist on a locked door. The puddle stilled, showing nothing but sky. Logic fought to reassert itself. Hallucination, fatigue, a trick of light and trauma. But deep inside, a colder certainty bloomed. The forest wasn't done with me. It wasn't letting me go. As I steadied myself, something caught my eye on a nearby tree. Fresh carvings etched deep into the bark, their edges wet with sap. The symbols were identical to those I'd seen on the stone marker buried deep in the woods. Strange constellations that seemed to map not stars but choices. When I'd first found them, I thought they were a warning. Now I wondered if they were instructions. Wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of smoke, though no fire burned nearby. The trailhead stood empty, eerily silent, but the air felt heavy, as if dozens of unseen lungs were holding the same breath. I glanced back at the forest and for an instant saw movement. Shadows slipping between trunks, retreating too quickly to name. My boots hesitated at the edge of the path. Home was just steps away. So was the possibility that stepping forward would reset everything, like a record needle dropping back at the start of a cursed song. My nightmare wasn't ending. It was only pausing, waiting for someone else to press play. I told myself to cross the threshold like a scientist, not a ghost. Observe, record, revise. Gravel crackled under my boots in a rhythm that once meant ordinary life. Coffee later, a shower, a story told too loudly. The parking lot held. The battered trail register and the sun-faded bulletin with corners chewed by weather. Beneath the plastic, a fresh sheet clung to the board. Ink bled into paper like a bruise. A hand-drawn map with a blank oval at the center, unlabeled and insistent. I signed the register anyway, hand shaking but legible, proof that I existed, outside the trees. As the pen lifted, the page seemed to breathe. My name ghosted twice, the second signature a hair ahead of mine, as if reality were rehearsing me. I closed the book and felt a tremor through the post, a small animal purring inside the wood. Forests are engines of memory, rings, seeds, paths worn into dirt by insistence alone. But what they didn't expect was that I had learned to listen back. I walked to the carved symbols and traced them with a broken fingernail. Sap glazed my skin, resin sweet as old hymns. The pattern echoed the stone marker's wheel with two new wedges, one toward town, one back into the trees. Choice, cut, into bark. I tore a page from my notebook and copied the design with ceremonial care, a promise to act rather than drift. Footsteps rustled the gravel behind me and I turned. A hiker stepped from the path, lean and sunburned in the hopeful way of people who still believe maps are promises. Their backpack was new, straps creaking like unbroken shoes. For a beat, I couldn't breathe. The silhouette matched the pack from the lodge photograph. Geometry echoed across years I didn't live, a circle closing like a fist. I smiled because warning without welcome sounds like superstition. I told them the truth the way I would read weather over a kitchen table. Trails twist, gear fails. Sometimes the woods return your footsteps with better posture. They smiled, mistaking caution for folklore. I didn't argue. I pressed the copied constellation into their palm instead. If the forest drafts us, perhaps we can annotate the margins, add footnotes it must honor. The wind shifted, the bulletin creaked, the day's light thinned to nickel. Behind the glass, the hand-drawn oval rippled as if a lake were printed there. My reflection smiled a second before I did. The hiker looked from the woods to the symbol sheet to me. A decision leaned inside them, tall as a tree about to fall. "Take the road," I said, "not the gap." My voice landed and stayed, a stone lodged in the river's mouth. They nodded, uncertain, and walked toward the gravel. I faced the gap again. On the tree, a new stroke had appeared in wet sap. A narrow wedge neither toward town nor deeper forest, but off to the side. A third option I hadn't considered. Wind lifted, carrying a low vibration like the first note of a distant choir. Somewhere, under the canopy, a lantern might have been swinging. I tucked the notebook to my ribs and stepped backward. Not away, but aside, aligning with the unfamiliar wedge. At the puddle's edge, my reflection waited, mouth moving a heartbeat ahead. I knelt and whispered a counter-memory, a story where the path refuses to close. Ripples erased the extra mouth. The air stilled, listening. If the forest remembers, perhaps it can be taught to remember differently. Then the water answered with one quiet ripple. Subscribe, if you dare.